My name is Cale Benjamin, and back in 2014, I had an experience that still feels more vivid than the memories of the years before or after it. I was in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, taking my RV out for a much-needed break from what I like to call the treadmill of modern life. I'd been through a nasty divorce and thought a solo trip to clear my head would be just what I needed. I was a city boy trying to find some calm in nature, but it turned out that nature had different plans for me. I pulled into a relatively secluded campground late in the afternoon, parked my RV, and set up. The air was crisp, carrying that slightly damp, earthy smell you only get in thick woods. There were a few other campers scattered about, but the place was quiet, exactly what I'd hoped for. My neighbors were a couple in their late 40s who gave me a quick wave before disappearing into their camper. On the other side of me was a guy who looked like he was in his 60s, with an old Ford truck and a tent that had seen better days. I made small talk with him briefly while unpacking. His name was Marty, and he had one of those dry senses of humor that made you chuckle before you realized he just insulted you. He joked that I'd probably burn my dinner if I tried cooking it over a fire. I laughed it off, but when he added that this place really isn't where you'd want to mess up and get noticed, it felt like a joke with a razor edge. I didn't think much of it at the time. As the evening wore on, the campground quieted. The couple's lights went out early, leaving only Marty and me with flickering firelight. I grilled a steak, drank a beer, and tried not to overthink things. Around 10 p.m., I started to hear movement in the woods behind the RV. At first, I chalked it up to animals. It's the wilderness. Deer, raccoons, maybe a black bear. Nothing I hadn't prepared for. But as the night deepened, the sounds became less sporadic and more deliberate. Branches cracked, and there was a faint rustling that didn't seem like the wind. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the woods. Nothing. A hollow laugh came from Marty's campsite. "Don't worry," he called out. "Could be worse. Could be someone trying to sneak up on you." Not exactly comforting, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't get under my skin. I double-checked the locks on my RV and decided to call it a night. As I lay in bed, the sounds outside seemed to amplify. By now, it wasn't just cracking branches. There were soft footfalls circling the RV, almost as if whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. Around midnight, the RV shook slightly, like someone had leaned against it. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and contemplated calling the park rangers. But what would I even say? I think someone's creeping around my RV? It felt ridiculous. I decided to wait it out. Big mistake. The next morning, I found muddy handprints smeared across the windows and sides of the RV. I was creeped out, but convinced myself it was some local prankster. Marty was gone, his tent packed up and his old truck missing. The couple from the other site had left too. I was now alone. Determined not to let paranoia ruin my trip, I spent the morning hiking. The trails were beautiful, the kind of serene that almost makes you forget how unforgiving nature can be. I even laughed at myself for getting worked up the night before. By the time I returned to the RV, it was late afternoon, and I was sweaty, hungry, and ready to relax. That's when I noticed something off. The door to my RV was slightly ajar. I'd locked it before leaving. My stomach sank. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning for anything out of place. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but as I moved to the kitchen area, I found a single muddy boot print on the floor. That's when I realized my hunting knife was missing from its sheath on the counter. Adrenaline surged through me as I searched the RV again. Whoever had been inside was gone, but the realization that someone had breached my space left me feeling exposed and furious. I decided to pack up and leave. As I loaded the RV, I spotted movement in the woods. A tall, wiry man emerged, wearing a tattered jacket and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. His face was sharp, almost gaunt, with a grin that felt too wide, like he was in on some cosmic joke I didn't understand. He stopped about 20 feet from me, just standing there, watching. "Lose something?" he asked, his voice gravelly and taunting. I didn't answer. My instinct told me to keep loading and get out of there. He took a step closer. "You don't look like you belong here," he said. "People like you never stick around long." "Not my problem," I snapped, trying to sound braver than I felt. He chuckled, a sound that made my skin crawl. "Not yet, anyway." I climbed into the RV and locked the door. As I started the engine, he stood there, unbothered, still grinning. I peeled out of the campground and onto the main road, my heart racing. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting him to appear again. After driving for about 20 minutes, I pulled into a gas station to collect myself. The attendant, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, gave me a once-over and asked if I was okay. I explained what had happened, and she didn't look surprised. "You must have run into Pete," she said. "Guy's been squatting out there for years. Rangers can't catch him, and he's mean as a snake. You're lucky you didn't find him in your RV." The thought sent a chill through me. I asked if she'd heard about him hurting anyone. She hesitated. "Not anyone that made it back to tell the tale." I didn't stick around to find out more. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported everything. They took it seriously, which was a small comfort, but when I asked what they planned to do, one ranger shrugged. "If it's Pete, he's been out there for decades, knows those woods better than we do. We'll check it out, but it's a big park." I didn't return to that campground or any campground for years. A few weeks later, I read an article about a missing hiker in the same area. It mentioned they'd found a campsite with strange markings carved into trees and an old hunting knife stuck in a log. I never checked to see if it was mine. As for Pete, the Rangers believed he was some sort of survivalist gone rogue, a man who had rejected society and lived off the grid, preying on the vulnerable. They never found him, but sometimes I think about his grin and wonder how many others it's been the last thing they've seen.
By this peaceful creek in a quiet clearing, a spot no one would think to find me for miles. The first few days were typical, hiking, fishing, and taking way too many pictures of trees for Instagram. But there's one thing I didn't post, a discovery that chilled me to my core. By the creek, half buried in the mud, was a deer skull. But the antlers? They were wrong. Twisted, warped, and fused together, way too many of them. No way that was natural. I'm not superstitious, but that thing set my nerves on edge. That night, something changed. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it, a scraping sound outside my RV. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or some other nocturnal critter. But then came the clicking, sharp and rhythmic, like bones snapping in quick succession, and then the wet, slurping sound, as if something was feeding. My blood ran cold. My hands gripped the edge of the bed, trembling. Whatever it wasn't just an animal. I stayed frozen, my breath shallow, listening as the sounds grew closer. The scraping moved along the side of the RV, and then silence. The kind of silence that eats at you, like the whole world is holding its breath. In the morning, I stepped outside, every muscle tense, expecting to find claw marks or bloodstains. But there was nothing, not a single trace. I should have left then and there, but my stubborn pride kept me rooted. The next night, the noises returned. But this time, they came with a shadow. A figure passed by my window, a twisted mockery of a deer standing upright. Its legs were too long, bending backward in an unnatural gait. And those antlers, they writhed like living things, a grotesque crown of writhing bone. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. When daylight came, I packed up in a blind panic, my hands fumbling with every latch and lever. By the time I hit the interstate, I still couldn't shake the feeling of those glowing eyes watching me. For weeks, I was a wreck, jumping at every sound, every shadow. Then I read the news. A couple had vanished from the same part of the forest. People blamed a bear, but I knew better. The Cherokee legends spoke of something ancient, a shapeshifter, a guardian of sacred places. I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't escape the thought that it might still be hunting me. So I went back. I prepared offerings, wooden carvings, herbs, trinkets said to appease the spirits. And I brought my pistol, even though I wasn't sure it would make a difference. The drive back felt like stepping into my own grave. The trees seemed darker, the shadows longer, like the forest itself had come alive. The first 2 nights were quiet, but on the third, the cameras caught it. The grainy footage showed that same twisted creature, its antlers writhing, its glowing eyes scanning the clearing. It sniffed the offerings, but didn't touch them. Instead, it turned, toward the camera, toward me. I stepped into the clearing, my pistol heavy in my hand. My voice cracked as I spoke. "Leave me alone. Leave everyone alone." The creature emerged, its clicking filling the air, louder now, almost mocking. It didn't hesitate. It charged faster than anything I'd ever seen. I fired, the gunshots shattering the night. It screamed, a sound that burrowed into my soul. I ran. My foot caught on a root and I tumbled, twisting my ankle. Pain lanced up my leg, but I scrambled forward, desperate. When I finally reached the RV and slammed the door shut, the forest fell silent once more. I drove until the gaslight came on, stopping only when the sun was high in the sky. I haven't gone back since. I don't think I ever will. That thing in the forest, it tasted my fear. And if it finds me again, I know it won't stop until it's had its fill. It all began with a bad decision, as these things always do. I should have stuck to the main trails in the Gila National Forest, but the pull of Devil's Pass was too strong to resist. The name itself, Devil's Pass, was a warning, yet I ignored it. The prospect of capturing something unique for my nature photography portfolio clouded my judgment. At the ranger station, I met Sam and Kelly. Meeting them felt like fate, or maybe a warning. Sam was wiry and rugged, his grizzled beard and overconfidence barely concealing a certain recklessness. Kelly, his wife, was his opposite. Quiet, withdrawn, and visibly worn down by years of following Sam's ill-conceived adventures. "You're heading to Devil's Pass?" Sam asked, eyeing my map. "We're going there too, safer in numbers." I hesitated. I preferred solitude, but something in his insistence, and Kelly's wary expression, made me agree. The trail was more dangerous than I'd anticipated. Barely a mile in, Kelly's boots started to fall apart. "These things are garbage," she muttered, holding up the peeling sole. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, but Sam scoffed. "She's fine," he said sharply, grabbing duct tape from my pack to patch her boot. Kelly gave me a weak smile, but I could see her frustration simmering beneath the surface. We pressed on, the forest thickening around us. The trail markers began to vanish, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. An acrid smell lingered in the air, growing stronger the deeper we went. "You sure this is the right way?" I asked, the terrain no longer matching the map. "Trust me," Sam said, waving me off. "The ridge is just ahead." He was right. The ridge offered a breathtaking view, the jagged cliffs painted in hues of gold by the setting sun. I snapped a few photos while Sam set up camp near a cluster of strange, weathered rocks. It wasn't until dusk that we noticed the petroglyphs. "These don't look like anything I've ever seen," Kelly murmured, running her fingers over a carving of a humanoid figure with antlers and unnaturally long limbs. "Probably just some old art," Sam said dismissively, but the carvings felt alive, their empty eyes following us as we moved. That night, I woke to a sound I couldn't place, a soft whisper carried on the wind. "Jenna." My heart hammered in my chest. I sat up, scanning the darkness, but nothing moved. "Jenna, come here." I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the campsite. The others were asleep. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, shaking Kelly awake. "What?" she mumbled groggily. "A voice," I said, my own trembling. "Someone's out there." She listened for a moment, then shook her head. "It's just the wind. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. I sat awake, listening to the whispers until dawn. The next day, we pushed deeper into the pass. The trees closed in, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The acrid smell grew overwhelming, and then we found it, a crude altar in a clearing. The stone slab was covered in animal bones and charred remains. In the center was a blackened mass, unrecognizable but undeniably wrong. "What the hell is this?" Kelly whispered, her face pale. "Probably some kind of ritual site," Sam said, but his bravado faltered. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, a rustling came from the trees. We froze. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long, its head a grotesque deer skull with twisted antlers. Its glowing red eyes locked onto us, and it took a jerky step forward. "Run," I whispered, but my legs refused to move. The creature stepped closer, its breath rasping like wind through dead leaves. "Run," I screamed, breaking the spell. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush. Kelly stumbled, but Sam yanked her up, and we didn't stop until we reached the campsite. The fire was out, the RV eerily untouched. But something was wrong. "We're leaving," I said, fumbling for the keys. "No," Sam said firmly. "If we drive now, we'll get lost." "Better lost than dead," I snapped. Before the argument could escalate, Kelly grabbed my arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Do you hear that?" It was Kelly's voice, but it was coming from the trees. "Help me," the voice called, perfect in tone but hollow in its desperation. "That's not me," Kelly said, her face pale as death. The RV rocked violently, as if something massive was pushing it. A voice came again, my voice this time. "Come out, Jenna. It's safe." Sam grabbed a knife, but he looked as terrified as Kelly, who was sobbing into her hands. I grabbed the flare gun from the emergency kit and yanked the door open. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes fixed on me. "Come closer," it whispered, mimicking my voice. My hands trembled as I aimed the flare gun and fired. The flare hit its chest, igniting it in a burst of light. The creature screamed, a sound that wasn't one voice but many, layered and inhuman. Then it vanished into the dark. We didn't wait to see if it would return. Sam floored the RV, and we didn't stop until we reached the ranger station. I uploaded my photos a week later, hoping for something salvageable. That's when I saw it, a picture I didn't remember taking. In the background, the creature stood behind me, its glowing eyes boring into the camera. I haven't been back to the wilderness since. I swear, budget travelers are the cheapest people around. My cousin An convinced me to road trip across the country in this beat-up RV he scored off Craigslist. His whole pitch? "We'll save a fortune on hotels, dude." Yeah, maybe if you don't factor in the gas mileage for this behemoth. Right now, we're somewhere in Tennessee, I think. Honestly, after a while, all those back roads and state parks blur together. Don't get me wrong, it's beautiful out here. Anne's all about the hiking and nature stuff. Me? I'm cool as long as I've got cell service and a cold beer at the end of the day. Last night, we pulled into this roadside campground on the edge of some thick, tangled woods. Figured it'd be a quick overnight, hit the road by sunrise kind of deal. But when An went to check us in, the old lady at the campground station, she had to be at least 100, was nowhere to be found. Most folks would call it a night, leave a note, or whatever. But not Anne. "Free camping," he said, his eyes practically glowing. "Let's ditch the hookups and go wild camping." I wasn't sure about all that, but whatever. We found a secluded spot near the woods. I killed the engine, and the forest went dead quiet. That kind of quiet that feels wrong, you know? An, oblivious, started unpacking his ridiculously oversized hiking backpack. "Gonna snag us some trout for dinner," Ganeski declared. "You want to come? And miss out on setting up prime ghost-watching territory? No way, man." I laughed, already settling into a lawn chair with a cold one. An just shrugged, tossed me a "you're lost" look, and disappeared into the trees. That's when things started getting weird. It was barely dusk, but the forest was already as dark as pitch. All the usual night sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional owl were absent. The silence was oppressive. Then I heard it. Rustling behind the RV. At first I thought it was a squirrel or raccoon, but the noise was heavier, deliberate. I peeked through the RV window. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like 1,000 eyes were staring out from the shadows. The rustling got louder, circling the RV. I grabbed my pocket knife off the counter, not that it would do much against anything bigger than a possum. Suddenly, something slammed into the side of the RV. The whole thing rocked, and I yelped, dropping the knife. My heart was pounding. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. Except it wasn't a growl. It was wet and ragged, like a cough dragged out of something not quite human. I pressed myself against the RV window, trying to see. Then I caught a glimpse, a silhouette against the trees. It was massive, hunched, and moving on way too many legs. My brain stuttered trying to process it. The shape was all wrong, like something twisted out of a nightmare. The RV rocked again. The thing was circling. Its heavy footsteps thudded closer. I curled up in the driver's seat, trying to disappear into the upholstery. The noises outside stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt like the thing was listening, waiting. Hours passed. At least, I think they did. Time stretches when you're waiting to die. Just as I started to believe the thing had left, I heard scratching. It was coming from above on the roof. The sound was deliberate, clawed. Then came a wet thump. Something heavy had landed up there. My breath hitched as the scratching turned into scraping, slow, methodical, back and forth. I couldn't breathe. And then came sniffing. Right above the air vent. I could almost feel its hot breath, smell its stench, rotten meat and something worse. "Dude, you in there? Found some killer trout, man? You gotta see this." Anne's voice shattered the tension, muffled through the RV walls. Relief flooded through me, but only for a second. "Dude?" He called again, then fell silent. A moment later, a blood-curdling scream cut through the night. It ended abruptly, as if someone had yanked the sound out of existence. The scratching on the roof stopped. Silence, heavy, suffocating silence. My whole body locked up. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I strained to hear anything that would tell me An was okay. Then, from the woods, I heard rustling again. The thing was retreating, dragging something heavy. I didn't need to see to know what it had. I forced myself to move, fumbling for the keys. The engine coughed to life, and I floored it. I didn't stop until I reached a diner miles away, its neon lights flickering like a lifeline. Inside, I nursed watery coffee with shaking hands. I couldn't eat. My mind kept replaying the creature's shape, its glowing eyes, and scream. I should have told someone. The cops, the waitress, anyone. But how do you explain a monster from the woods? No one would believe me. And what if they found nothing? Worse, what if they found Anne, or what was left of him? I ditched the RV in a grocery store parking lot at dawn, took what little cash I had, a burner phone, and started walking. Maybe I'll keep moving, always looking over my shoulder. They call creatures like that skin riders. Urban legends, ghost stories meant to scare kids around campfires. Turns out, some stories have teeth. I wish An hadn't been so into nature. Hell, I wish I'd never agreed to this stupid trip. But it's too late now. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, those sounds will haunt me forever. I'm never going into the woods again. My name's Max Holloway, and back in 2017, I decided to take my old RV on a trip to Badlands National Park in South Dakota. I figured a few days of solitude might help me sort out my tangled thoughts, or at least give me a solid excuse to skip my ex's wedding. Just a guy and his questionable life choices hitting the open road. After a couple of long days behind the wheel, I finally reached the park. The rugged landscape of eroded boats and jagged pinnacles stretched out before me like the bones of some ancient world. It was eerily beautiful, the kind of place that felt frozen in time, so still, so isolated, you could almost hear the echoes of a prehistoric past. I found a secluded spot far from the handful of other campers scattered throughout the park. The isolation felt like a blessing and a curse. A stark reminder of just how small I was in the grand scheme of things. As I set up camp, I cracked a joke to myself about finally finding a place quieter than my love life. My laugh echoed back at me, hollow in the vast emptiness. The first night was uneventful. I cooked up some canned beans and franks over a campfire, watched the stars light up the sky like scattered diamonds, and felt a rare sense of peace. But peace in a place like this has a way of turning on you. It was around midnight on the second night when I first heard it, faint rustling outside the RV. My mind immediately jumped to harmless explanations. A deer, maybe a raccoon nosing around. But something about the sound made my skin crawl. It wasn't frantic or random, like an animal. It was deliberate, slow. I peered out the window but saw nothing but shadows. The flashlight I brought with me sat on the counter, and after a moment of hesitation, I grabbed it and stepped outside. The cold air bit at my skin as I called out, "Who's there?" My voice sounded too loud, unnatural against the quiet. Nothing answered except the whisper of the wind through the rock formations. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the landscape, catching only twisted shapes of stone and the stark outlines of distant boots. Shaking off my unease, I retreated to the RV, locking the door and convincing myself it was just my imagination. Then came the thud. It was sharp, jarring, and came from the back of the RV. My heart raced as I grabbed a tire iron from beneath the seat, a poor excuse for a weapon, but better than nothing. I edged toward the rear, every instinct screaming for me to stay put. Another thud followed, this one louder, accompanied by the faint scrape of something against metal. Summoning every ounce of courage, I flung open the rear door, shining the flashlight into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just the endless, yawning void of night. But then, just beyond the reach of the light, a figure emerged. It was a man, or something resembling one. Tall, gaunt, with clothes that hung from him like rags, stained dark with what I prayed wasn't blood. His face was hollowed, his eyes glinting with a malevolence that set every nerve in my body on edge. "Nice night for camping, isn't it?" he rasped, his voice carrying a note of mockery that made my stomach churn. "Look, man," I stammered, raising the tire iron slightly. "I don't want any trouble." He tilted his head, a slow, deliberate motion that felt more predatory than human. "Trouble? No trouble," he said, stepping closer. "Just thought I'd say hello. Not many folks out here. Lonely, isn't it?" "Yeah, and I'd like to keep it that way," I snapped, trying to mask my growing terror with sarcasm. "So, if you don't mind—" "Sleep is the cousin of death," he interrupted, his grin widening to something that didn't belong on a human face. "Right? And curiosity killed the cat. What's your point?" His laugh was low and guttural, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "You've got spirit. I like that." Then he lunged. I swung the tire iron, the impact sending a jolt up my arm as it connected with his shoulder. He barely flinched. Before I could react, we were grappling, his strength far greater than his wiry frame suggested. His hands closed around my throat, squeezing with a force that made my vision blur. Desperation kicked in. My knee shot up, slamming into his groin. He let out a grunt, doubling over just long enough for me to grab the hunting knife strapped to his belt. The blade felt foreign in my hand, but instinct took over. When he lunged again, I thrust it forward, the sickening resistance as it sank into his side, almost making me vomit. He stumbled back, clutching the wound, his grin twisting into a snarl. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom before vanishing into the darkness. I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear, every sound outside amplified 100-fold. I sat clutching the knife, unable to close my eyes. The memory of his gaze burned into my mind. By dawn, I was tearing down camp, my only thought to get as far away as possible. The sight of flashing police lights near the park's exit was a relief like I'd never known. When the officer asked if I'd seen anyone suspicious, I recounted the encounter. His expression darkened. "You just described Vincent Kane," he said. "Escaped convict. Dangerous. You're lucky to be alive." Lucky? Maybe. But as I drove away, the weight of what had happened and what could have settled over me. The Badlands had shown me something I didn't want to see. The line between man and monster is thinner than we think. Next time, I'd stick to beaches. Monsters are easier to spot in the sunlight. My name is Daniel Fisher, and I was 25 years old when this happened in the fall of 2022. I've always been a skeptic. Science, facts, logic. That's my religion. Ghost stories and urban legends? They're just entertainment, a way for people to make sense of what they can't explain. At least that's what I thought before that weekend in Dolly Sods. It was supposed to be a routine backpacking trip. Just me, my best friend Chris, and his girlfriend Lila. Chris and I had been hiking together since college, and while Lila was newer to the group, she was no rookie. She'd done some Appalachian Trail sections and could hold her own. The plan was simple. 3 days in Dolly Sods wilderness, a rugged stretch of land in West Virginia known for its otherworldly landscapes. Chris had picked it after reading about its haunted reputation. I rolled my eyes but agreed it would be a good story for him to tell over beers. We set off on a Friday morning, our packs heavy with gear, water, and food. The first few hours were uneventful. The air was crisp, the trail well marked, and the scenery stunning. Lila walked a few paces ahead, her long braids swinging as she stopped every so often to snap photos. Chris was his usual self, cracking jokes about the ghosts watching us. "You think Casper's going to show up and roast marshmallows with us?" he said, nudging my arm. "More like Bigfoot," I replied. "Hope you packed extra jerky." By midday, we'd veered off the main trail onto a less traveled path. That was our first mistake. Chris insisted it would be more authentic, a word that always meant trouble. Lila looked uneasy, but didn't argue. I should have turned us back then, but my pride wouldn't let me admit we were heading into uncharted territory. That night, we set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The sky was clear, and the stars were so bright you could almost forget civilization existed. After dinner, we sat around the fire, trading stories and laughing. Lila was quieter than usual, her eyes darting to the trees every so often. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah," she said quickly, forcing a smile. I don't know. This place feels weird, like it's watching us." Chris laughed. "The sods have eyes, huh?" "Don't worry, babe. I'll protect you from the big bad forest." I rolled my eyes. "Let's call it a night. Long day tomorrow." We crawled into our tents, and I was out within minutes. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of whispers, faint, like they were carried on the wind. I lay still, straining to hear. It wasn't words exactly, more like a murmur, but it felt deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. "Chris?" I called softly. No answer. I swept the beam across the clearing. Nothing. Just the flicker of dying embers in the fire pit and the sway of the trees. I chalked it up to my imagination and went back to sleep. The next morning, Lila looked pale, dark circles under her eyes. "You okay?" Chris asked, pouring her a cup of instant coffee. She hesitated. "I heard something last night. Whispering." Chris grinned. "I see. I told you ghosts. They probably wanted some s'mores." I expected her to laugh, but she didn't. Instead, she shot me a look like she was silently asking if I'd heard it too. I nodded, and her face tightened. We packed up and moved on, but the mood was different. Lila kept glancing over her shoulder, and even Chris was quieter than usual. By midday, our GPS started acting up, refusing to lock onto satellites. I pulled out the paper map, but it was no use. The terrain didn't match anything on it. "We're lost," I said. "Let's just backtrack," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. Chris shook his head. "We're fine. The trail's got to be around here somewhere." We pressed on, but the more we walked, the stranger things became. The trees seemed closer together, their branches intertwining like skeletal hands. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. And then there were the tracks. Hoof prints in the mud, but not from any deer. They were too deep, too large. Some even looked like they ended in clawed toes. I tried to dismiss them, but Lila froze when she saw them. "This isn't normal," she whispered. Chris shrugged. "Probably just an old cow or something." "In the middle of dolly sods?" she snapped. "We're miles from any farms." We kept walking, but the tension was palpable. That evening, we stumbled upon a clearing with a circle of stones in the center. At first, I thought it was a fire pit, but as we got closer, I saw the bones, animal bones, bleached white and arranged in strange patterns. Chris let out a nervous laugh. "Well, that's not creepy at all." "We need to leave," Lila said firmly. "Now, it's just some weirdo's idea of art," Chris said. But even he looked uneasy. "Let's camp somewhere else." We moved another mile before setting up camp, but none of us slept well. The whispers came again, louder this time and closer. They weren't just sounds, they were voices calling our names. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like Chris outside my tent, his voice low and urgent. "Jake, come here." I unzipped the tent, but he wasn't there, just darkness and the rustle of leaves. When I checked his tent, he was sound asleep. The next morning, Lila refused to go any further. "I'm done," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to go back." We don't even know which way back is, Chris argued. Then we stay put and wait for help. Out here, with no signal? No way. I sided with Chris, though I regretted it almost immediately. By midday, we were hopelessly lost, the forest closing in around us. That's when it took Chris. He'd wandered off to relieve himself while Lila and I rested by a fallen log. 5 minutes passed, then 10. When he didn't come back, we called his name. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and started searching, Lila close behind. We found him an hour later, or what was left of him. He was hanging from a tree, his face twisted in terror, his body mangled like something had torn him apart. Lila screamed, and I barely kept from throwing up. We didn't stay to examine him. We ran. By nightfall, we were utterly lost. The whispers followed us, louder now, more insistent, and then we saw it. A figure at the edge of our firelight. It looked human, but its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally. Its glowing eyes burned into me, and when it spoke, it used my voice. "Jake, come here." Lila started chanting under her breath, something about sage and protection. The figure hissed and retreated, but I knew it wasn't gone. We didn't sleep that night, and by dawn we were stumbling through the forest, exhausted and terrified. When we finally reached the edge of the woods, I almost cried. We collapsed near a ranger station, and when they found us, we tried to explain, but no one believed us. They chalked it up to exposure and trauma. Chris's body was never found. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't plan to. Whatever's out there, it's not meant to be understood. And I know one thing for sure. Some legends are real. My name is Emma Williams, and I'm 40 years old. This happened last October when I decided to camp alone at Smoke Hollow, a remote site near the Greenbrier River in West Virginia. I thought it would be a quiet, picturesque trip, a chance to photograph the eerie beauty of an old settlement long forgotten by time. Instead, I barely made it out alive. The idea came to me while scrolling through an article about abandoned places. Smoke Hollow was once a bustling logging village in the late 1800s. But in the early 1900s, its population vanished under mysterious circumstances. All that remained were the ruins of a few homes and a cemetery overgrown with moss and wild ivy. Local legends spoke of ghostly wails echoing through the hollow at night, but I figured those were just stories to scare off tourists. I was drawn to the place because it sounded like the perfect subject for my blog, Forgotten Trails. After my divorce, exploring remote and spooky locations became my therapy. Documenting these places filled the empty hours and gave me purpose. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I welcomed it. At least that's what I told myself. The road to Smoke Hollow was narrow and winding, with ancient trees towering on either side. By the time I arrived at the campground, the late afternoon sun was hidden behind thick gray clouds. The place was deserted, except for a lone park ranger at the check-in station. "First time here?" she asked, smiling. Her name tag read Maya Andrews. "Yeah, heard about it online," I said. Maya nodded. "Beautiful spot, but it can be disorienting. Fog rolls in heavy, and the echoes in the hollow can mess with your sense of direction. Stay on marked paths, and you'll be fine." Her words didn't bother me. I'd camped alone before. I smiled, thanked her, and drove to my site near the river. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint earthy smell of decaying leaves. I parked my RV, set up my gear, and took a short hike to the cemetery before nightfall. The graveyard was small, maybe 20 headstones, most of them cracked or leaning. One in particular caught my eye. A child's grave marked Lillian Reed, 1898 to 1905. A small lamb was carved into the stone, worn smooth by time. I snapped a few photos, the sky darkening faster than I expected, and headed back to camp. That night, the fog came in thick and fast, pressing against the RV windows like a living thing. I was reviewing my photos when I heard it. A faint, high-pitched wail cutting through the silence. It sounded like a child crying. I froze, my heart thumping. It couldn't be an animal. It was too human. I turned off the lights and peered outside. The fog distorted everything, but I saw no movement. I told myself it was just the wind and tried to go back to editing. But the cry came again, this time closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shivering in the cold. "Hello?" I called, my voice swallowed by the mist. "Is someone there?" Nothing, just the river gurgling faintly in the distance. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I went back inside, I locked the door and pulled the blinds shut. It was a long time before I fell asleep. The next morning, I found wet handprints on my RV windows, small ones, like a child's. My stomach churned. The fog had cleared, leaving the woods damp and muddy, but there were no tracks around the RV, no signs anyone had been there. Shaking off the unease, I decided to head back to the cemetery. It was brighter in the daylight, though the thick canopy still gave the place a shadowy quality. I noticed something I hadn't seen the day before: a journal lying partially buried beneath a toppled tombstone. Curiosity got the better of me. I brushed off the dirt and opened it. The faded handwriting belonged to someone named Eleanor Reed, likely a mother to the child whose grave I'd seen. The entries were ordinary at first, mentioning chores and weather, but they took a darker turn near the end. One passage stuck with me. "Lillian hears them at night, the crying children. I thought she was dreaming, but now I hear them too. We must leave, but the forest won't let us go." My hands trembled as I closed the journal. It was just an old story, I told myself, a grieving mother's imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with this place. That night, the crying returned, louder and more insistent. I stayed inside, clutching my flashlight. The sound circled the RV, as if whoever or whatever it was wanted me to follow. I fought the urge to look, but then the generator failed, plunging me into complete darkness. I scrambled for my backup lantern, fumbling with the switch. When it flickered to life, I saw them. Small, wet footprints leading from the door to the far corner of the RV. My breath caught. The crying had stopped, replaced by faint, rapid tapping on the windows. "Go away," I whispered, backing into a corner. The tapping grew louder, frantic, then stopped altogether. The silence was worse. I felt trapped, as though the darkness was closing in, suffocating me. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I was exhausted and desperate to leave. But when I stepped outside, I saw deep scratches raked across the RV's exterior. The tires were slashed, the rubber shredded like paper. My heart sank. I was stranded. I decided to hike back to the cemetery, hoping to find a clue in Eleanor's journal, or at least distract myself, but the path felt different this time, unfamiliar. The trees seemed to shift around me, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. I stumbled into the clearing, and my blood ran cold. A figure stood by Lillian's grave. At first, I thought it was a child, but something about its proportions was wrong. Its arms too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It turned toward me, and I saw its face. Hollow eyes and a wide, dripping grin. Water pooled around its feet, soaking the earth. I couldn't move. It opened its mouth, emitting a guttural, inhuman wail that echoed through the trees. My legs finally obeyed, and I ran, the sound chasing me all the way back to the RV. That night, the entity attacked. It battered the RV, its cries deafening. The windows rattled, the walls creaked. I remembered the journal's warning: the forest won't let us go. But it wasn't the forest. It was this thing, this embodiment of grief and rage. I thought of what Maya had said about echoes. Desperate, I turned on my phone and played a voice recording I'd taken of her advice. Stay near the marked paths. Her calm, human voice cut through the chaos like a beacon. The entity recoiled, its form flickering. I grabbed the journal, clutching it like a talisman, and shouted, "Lillian, stop! You're free!" The wailing stopped. The air grew still. For a moment, I thought it was over, until I heard a soft, wet laugh behind me. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. The RV was abandoned behind me. A passing car picked me up, and I barely managed to explain what had happened. When we passed Smoke Hollow, I saw the figure standing in the fog, its hollow eyes following me. I never went back to Smoke Hollow. The photos I took were strange, blurry, distorted, as though the camera couldn't quite capture the truth. But one image haunts me most. A figure standing by Lillian's grave, its face staring straight into the lens. And I've stopped camping alone. Some silences are meant to stay undisturbed. Let me know if there are further edits or formatting adjustments needed. Understood. Here's the paragraph exactly as requested. My name is Emma Williams, and I'm 40 years old. This happened last October when I decided to camp alone at Smoke Hollow, a remote site near the Greenbrier River in West Virginia. I thought it would be a quiet, picturesque trip, a chance to photograph the eerie beauty of an old settlement long forgotten by time. Instead, I barely made it out alive. The idea came to me while scrolling through an article about abandoned places. Smoke Hollow was once a bustling logging village in the late 1800s, but in the early 1900s, its population vanished under mysterious circumstances. All that remained were the ruins of a few homes and a cemetery overgrown with moss and wild ivy. Local legends spoke of ghostly wails echoing through the hollow at night, but I figured those were just stories to scare off tourists. I was drawn to the place because it sounded like the perfect subject for my blog, Forgotten Trails. After my divorce, exploring remote and spooky locations became my therapy. Documenting these places filled the empty hours and gave me purpose. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I welcomed it. At least that's what I told myself. The road to Smoke Hollow was narrow and winding, with ancient trees towering on either side. By the time I arrived at the campground, the late afternoon sun was hidden behind thick gray clouds. The place was deserted, except for a lone park ranger at the check-in station. "First time here?" she asked, smiling. Her name tag read Maya Andrews. "Yeah, heard about it online," I said. Maya nodded. "Beautiful spot, but it can be disorienting. Fog rolls in heavy, and the echoes in the hollow can mess with your sense of direction. Stay on marked paths, and you'll be fine." Her words didn't bother me. I'd camped alone before. I smiled, thanked her, and drove to my site near the river. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint earthy smell of decaying leaves. I parked my RV, set up my gear, and took a short hike to the cemetery before nightfall. The graveyard was small, maybe 20 headstones, most of them cracked or leaning. One in particular caught my eye. A child's grave marked Lillian Reed, 1898 to 1905. A small lamb was carved into the stone, worn smooth by time. I snapped a few photos, the sky darkening faster than I expected, and headed back to camp. That night, the fog came in thick and fast, pressing against the RV windows like a living thing. I was reviewing my photos when I heard it. A faint, high-pitched wail cutting through the silence. It sounded like a child crying. I froze, my heart thumping. It couldn't be an animal. It was too human. I turned off the lights and peered outside. The fog distorted everything, but I saw no movement. I told myself it was just the wind and tried to go back to editing. But the cry came again, this time closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shivering in the cold. "Hello?" I called, my voice swallowed by the mist. "Is someone there?" Nothing, just the river gurgling faintly in the distance. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I went back inside, I locked the door and pulled the blinds shut. It was a long time before I fell asleep. The next morning, I found wet handprints on my RV windows, small ones, like a child's. My stomach churned. The fog had cleared, leaving the woods damp and muddy, but there were no tracks around the RV, no signs anyone had been there. Shaking off the unease, I decided to head back to the cemetery. It was brighter in the daylight, though the thick canopy still gave the place a shadowy quality. I noticed something I hadn't seen the day before, a journal lying partially buried beneath a toppled tombstone. Curiosity got the better of me. I brushed off the dirt and opened it. The faded handwriting belonged to someone named Eleanor Reed, likely a mother to the child whose grave I'd seen. The entries were ordinary at first, mentioning chores and weather, but they took a darker turn near the end. One passage stuck with me. "Lillian hears them at night, the crying children. I thought she was dreaming, but now I hear them too. We must leave, but the forest won't let us go." My hands trembled as I closed the journal. It was just an old story, I told myself, a grieving mother's imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with this place. That night, the crying returned, louder and more insistent. I stayed inside, clutching my flashlight. The sound circled the RV, as if whoever or whatever it was wanted me to follow. I fought the urge to look, but then the generator failed, plunging me into complete darkness. I scrambled for my backup lantern, fumbling with the switch. When it flickered to life, I saw them. Small, wet footprints leading from the door to the far corner of the RV. My breath caught. The crying had stopped, replaced by faint, rapid tapping on the windows. "Go away," I whispered, backing into a corner. The tapping grew louder, frantic, then stopped altogether. The silence was worse. I felt trapped, as though the darkness was closing in, suffocating me. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I was exhausted and desperate to leave. But when I stepped outside, I saw deep scratches raked across the RV's exterior. The tires were slashed, the rubber shredded like paper. My heart sank. I was stranded. I decided to hike back to the cemetery, hoping to find a clue in Eleanor's journal, or at least distract myself, but the path felt different this time, unfamiliar. The trees seemed to shift around me, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. I stumbled into the clearing, and my blood ran cold. A figure stood by Lillian's grave. At first, I thought it was a child, but something about its proportions was wrong. Its arms too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It turned toward me, and I saw its face. Hollow eyes and a wide, dripping grin. Water pooled around its feet, soaking the earth. I couldn't move. It opened its mouth, emitting a guttural, inhuman wail that echoed through the trees. My legs finally obeyed, and I ran, the sound chasing me all the way back to the RV. That night, the entity attacked. It battered the RV, its cries deafening. The windows rattled, the walls creaked. I remembered the journal's warning, "The forest won't let us go." But it wasn't the forest. It was this thing, this embodiment of grief and rage. I thought of what Maya had said about echoes. Desperate, I turned on my phone and played a voice recording I'd taken of her advice. Stay near the marked paths. Her calm, human voice cut through the chaos like a beacon. The entity recoiled, its form flickering. I grabbed the journal, clutching it like a talisman, and shouted, "Lillian, stop! You're free!" The wailing stopped. The air grew still. For a moment, I thought it was over, until I heard a soft, wet laugh behind me. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. The RV was abandoned behind me. A passing car picked me up, and I barely managed to explain what had happened. When we passed Smoke Hollow, I saw the figure standing in the fog, its hollow eyes following me. I never went back to Smoke Hollow. The photos I took were strange, blurry, distorted, as though the camera couldn't quite capture the truth. But one image haunts me most. A figure standing by Lillian's grave, its face staring straight into the lens. And I've stopped camping alone. Some silences are meant to stay undisturbed. My name is Julian Arnold, and I'm 30 years old. This happened in the remote woods near Spruce Knob Lake, West Virginia. I thought it would be a fun little adventure, a chance to reconnect with my old friend Mike Carson, who's 31, while writing a travel piece about hidden gems in the Appalachian wilderness. I didn't expect we'd encounter something that would haunt us forever. The trip started out as a mix of nostalgia and practicality. Mike and I used to camp together years ago, back when we both lived in the same town. Life had pulled us in different directions, but I wanted to rekindle that bond and maybe get some good material for my article. When I pitched the idea of camping by the lake, Mike hesitated. "Are you sure about that spot, Clara? I've heard weird things about that area," he said. "Come on, Mike. It'll be fine," I replied, brushing off his concerns. "What's the worst that could happen? Bears? We'll keep the food locked up." Reluctantly, he agreed, and the following weekend, we loaded up my old RV, a temperamental beast prone to sputtering at the worst times, and headed into the mountains. The drive to Spruce Knob was stunning, with the rolling hills and dense forests that seemed to swallow us whole. As we ascended the winding roads, we reached the lake just before sunset. The water shimmered in the golden light, and the surrounding trees stood tall and silent, as if guarding the place. A few fishermen waved at us from a distance, but as we drove deeper into the woods to find a secluded campsite, we left the last signs of civilization behind. We parked the RV in a small clearing near the tree line. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, oppressive silence. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the quiet of nature, and we got to work setting up camp. Mike built a fire while I fiddled with the propane stove, which, true to form, refused to work. "Guess we're doing everything the old-fashioned way," I said with a laugh, though I could tell Mike was annoyed. "Should have brought my own gear," he muttered. "This thing's a death trap." That night, as we sat around the fire, we shared stories and beers, laughing about our old adventures. It felt good, like old times. But as the fire burned low, I started to notice odd things. First, there were the noises. At first, it was faint, like children's laughter carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear, but when I asked Mike if he heard it, he shook his head. "You're imagining things," he said, tossing another log on the fire. But I wasn't. The laughter grew louder, mingling with what sounded like whispers, though I couldn't make out the words. I glanced over my shoulder at the dark woods, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe a trick of the mind after a long day. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. It reminded me of roadkill left out in the sun for too long. Mike smelled it too, and he looked uneasy for the first time. "Maybe a dead deer nearby," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We went to bed soon after that, locking ourselves inside the RV. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching us. The next morning, we decided to explore the woods around the lake. I had my camera slung over my shoulder, ready to capture the natural beauty of the area, but what we found was anything but beautiful. It started with the animal carcasses. We stumbled upon a trail of them. Raccoons, rabbits, even a deer, all mutilated in ways that didn't seem natural. Their bodies were arranged in a line as if they were pointing toward something. My stomach turned, but I couldn't look away. "What the hell is this?" Mike whispered, his face pale. "I don't know," I said. "A bear? Wolves?" But deep down, I didn't believe that. The wounds were too precise, too deliberate. The trail led us to a clearing where an ancient tree stood, its gnarled branches twisting skyward like skeletal fingers. The bark was blackened, as if it had been burned, but the tree was very much alive. It exuded a strange energy, making the air around it feel thick and heavy. I felt a chill run down my spine just looking at it. "This must be the devil's tree," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The what?" "I read about it online," he admitted. "Locals say it's cursed. Some witch was hanged here in the 1800s, and her spirit supposedly haunts it." "Great. You tell me this now," I said, half joking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be there. We didn't stay long. The whispers started again, louder this time, and they seemed to be coming from the tree itself. I snapped a few photos before we retreated back to the RV. Things escalated quickly after that. That night, the whispers returned, but they weren't outside anymore. They were inside the RV. I woke up to the sound of my father's voice calling my name, even though he'd been dead for years. "Clara, come here," the voice beckoned. It sounded so real, so warm, that for a moment I believed it. But when I got up and looked outside, there was nothing there. Just the dark woods and the faint outline of the devil's tree in the distance. Mike wasn't doing any better. He claimed he saw me standing outside the RV, staring at him through the window, but I hadn't left my bed. The next morning, we found claw marks on the RV's walls, deep, jagged scratches that hadn't been there before. Mike wanted to leave, but the engine wouldn't start, no matter what we tried. The RV refused to move. "We're stuck here," he said grimly. "We need to figure out how to end this." We decided to confront the tree, though neither of us really knew what we were doing. Armed with a can of lighter fluid and a box of matches, we trekked back to the clearing. The whispers grew louder as we approached, morphing into a cacophony of voices, some pleading, some angry, some crying. My hands trembled as I doused the base of the tree with fluid. "Are you sure about this?" Mike asked, his voice shaking. "No," I admitted, "but we don't have a choice." I struck the match and tossed it onto the tree. The flames roared to life, but almost immediately they were snuffed out, as if an unseen hand had smothered them. The air grew cold, and the shadows around us began to move. That's when we saw it, a figure emerging from the tree itself. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide. It didn't move toward us, but its presence was enough to paralyze me with fear. "You trespassed," it said, though its lips didn't move. "Blood for blood." Mike grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my trance. "Run," he shouted, and we bolted back toward the RV. The entity didn't follow us, but its voice echoed in our heads, growing fainter the farther we ran. Back at the RV, we found a knife and debated what to do. The entity wanted blood. Did it mean a sacrifice? I wasn't about to offer myself or Mike, but we had to do something. In a desperate act, I cut my palm and let the blood drip onto the ground outside the RV. I didn't know if it would work, but the whispers stopped almost immediately. The air grew warmer and the oppressive feeling lifted. A moment later, the RV roared to life on its own. Without wasting another second, we got in and drove away, leaving the Devil's Tree behind. I never wrote about that trip, not the truth anyway. The article I published was a generic piece about camping tips and scenic views, but the memory of what happened near Spruce Knob Lake still lingers. I don't know if the entity has gone for good or if it's waiting for the next trespasser to stumble upon its cursed domain. All I know is I'm never going back. Here's the paragraph copied exactly as requested. "My name is Julian Arnold, and I'm 30 years old. This happened in the remote woods near Spruce Knob Lake, West Virginia. I thought it would be a fun little adventure, a chance to reconnect with my old friend Mike Carson, who's 31, while writing a travel piece about hidden gems in the Appalachian wilderness. I didn't expect we'd encounter something that would haunt us forever." The trip started out as a mix of nostalgia and practicality. Mike and I used to camp together years ago, back when we both lived in the same town. Life had pulled us in different directions, but I wanted to rekindle that bond and maybe get some good material for my article. When I pitched the idea of camping by the lake, Mike hesitated. "Are you sure about that spot, Clara? I've heard weird things about that area," he said. "Come on, Mike. It'll be fine," I replied, brushing off his concerns. "What's the worst that could happen? Bears? We'll keep the food locked up." Reluctantly, he agreed, and the following weekend, we loaded up my old RV, a temperamental beast prone to sputtering at the worst times, and headed into the mountains. The drive to Spruce Knob was stunning, with the rolling hills and dense forests that seemed to swallow us whole. As we ascended the winding roads, we reached the lake just before sunset. The water shimmered in the golden light, and the surrounding trees stood tall and silent, as if guarding the place. A few fishermen waved at us from a distance, but as we drove deeper into the woods to find a secluded campsite, we left the last signs of civilization behind. We parked the RV in a small clearing near the tree line. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, oppressive silence. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the quiet of nature, and we got to work setting up camp. Mike built a fire while I fiddled with the propane stove, which, true to form, refused to work. "Guess we're doing everything the old-fashioned way," I said with a laugh, though I could tell Mike was annoyed. "Should have brought my own gear," he muttered. "This thing's a death trap." That night, as we sat around the fire, we shared stories and beers, laughing about our old adventures. It felt good, like old times. But as the fire burned low, I started to notice odd things. First, there were the noises. At first, it was faint, like children's laughter carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear, but when I asked Mike if he heard it, he shook his head. "You're imagining things," he said, tossing another log on the fire. But I wasn't. The laughter grew louder, mingling with what sounded like whispers, though I couldn't make out the words. I glanced over my shoulder at the dark woods, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe a trick of the mind after a long day. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. It reminded me of roadkill left out in the sun for too long. Mike smelled it too, and he looked uneasy for the first time. Maybe a dead deer nearby, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We went to bed soon after that, locking ourselves inside the RV. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching us. The next morning, we decided to explore the woods around the lake. I had my camera slung over my shoulder, ready to capture the natural beauty of the area, but what we found was anything but beautiful. It started with the animal carcasses. We stumbled upon a trail of them. Raccoons, rabbits, even a deer, all mutilated in ways that didn't seem natural. Their bodies were arranged in a line as if they were pointing toward something. My stomach turned, but I couldn't look away. "What the hell is this?" Mike whispered, his face pale. "I don't know," I said. "A bear? Wolves?" But deep down, I didn't believe that. The wounds were too precise, too deliberate. The trail led us to a clearing where an ancient tree stood, its gnarled branches twisting skyward like skeletal fingers. The bark was blackened, as if it had been burned, but the tree was very much alive. It exuded a strange energy, making the air around it feel thick and heavy. I felt a chill run down my spine just looking at it. "This must be the devil's tree," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The what?" "I read about it online," he admitted. "Locals say it's cursed. Some witch was hanged here in the 1800s, and her spirit supposedly haunts it." "Great. You tell me this now," I said, half joking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be there. We didn't stay long. The whispers started again, louder this time, and they seemed to be coming from the tree itself. I snapped a few photos before we retreated back to the RV. Things escalated quickly after that. That night, the whispers returned, but they weren't outside anymore. They were inside the RV. I woke up to the sound of my father's voice calling my name, even though he'd been dead for years. "Clara, come here," the voice beckoned. It sounded so real, so warm, that for a moment I believed it. But when I got up and looked outside, there was nothing there. Just the dark woods and the faint outline of the devil's tree in the distance. Mike wasn't doing any better. He claimed he saw me standing outside the RV, staring at him through the window, but I hadn't left my bed. The next morning, we found claw marks on the RV's walls, deep, jagged scratches that hadn't been there before. Mike wanted to leave, but the engine wouldn't start, no matter what we tried. The RV refused to move. "We're stuck here," he said grimly. "We need to figure out how to end this." We decided to confront the tree, though neither of us really knew what we were doing. Armed with a can of lighter fluid and a box of matches, we trekked back to the clearing. The whispers grew louder as we approached, morphing into a cacophony of voices, some pleading, some angry, some crying. My hands trembled as I doused the base of the tree with fluid. "Are you sure about this?" Mike asked, his voice shaking. "No," I admitted, "but we don't have a choice." I struck the match and tossed it onto the tree. The flames roared to life, but almost immediately they were snuffed out, as if an unseen hand had smothered them. The air grew cold, and the shadows around us began to move. That's when we saw it, a figure emerging from the tree itself. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide. It didn't move toward us, but its presence was enough to paralyze me with fear. "You trespassed," it said, though its lips didn't move. "Blood for blood." Mike grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my trance. "Run," he shouted, and we bolted back toward the RV. The entity didn't follow us, but its voice echoed in our heads, growing fainter the farther we ran. Back at the RV, we found a knife and debated what to do. The entity wanted blood. Did it mean a sacrifice? I wasn't about to offer myself or Mike, but we had to do something. In a desperate act, I cut my palm and let the blood drip onto the ground outside the RV. I didn't know if it would work, but the whispers stopped almost immediately. The air grew warmer and the oppressive feeling lifted. A moment later, the RV roared to life on its own. Without wasting another second, we got in and drove away, leaving the devil's tree behind. I never wrote about that trip, not the truth anyway. The article I published was a generic piece about camping tips and scenic views. but the memory of what happened near Spruce Knob Lake still lingers. I don't know if the entity has gone for good or if it's waiting for the next trespasser to stumble upon its cursed domain. All I know is I'm never going back. My name is Emily Allen, and I'm 30 years old. This happened along Paint Creek Scenic Trail in West Virginia during a trip I'd planned to reconnect with my art and, frankly, myself. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the noise of the world, but instead it became something I still can't fully explain. I had just come off a long relationship that ended in the kind of breakup that leaves you questioning everything: your choices, your direction, your worth. Art was the only thing that felt steady, so I packed up my RV and hit the road. Paint Creek had come up in my research as a serene, lesser-known spot for nature lovers. I thought it would be the perfect place to spend a few days sketching and painting in solitude. When I arrived, the place was exactly as described: quiet, secluded, and hauntingly beautiful. The creek meandered through dense woods, its surface catching the sunlight like shards of glass. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air carried a faint chill that hinted at the coming fall. I parked my RV near an old wooden bridge that crossed the creek. The bridge looked like it belonged in a ghost story, its weathered boards sagging slightly, but I couldn't resist its charm. I set up camp and spent the first day wandering the trails and sketching the landscape. The stillness was almost too perfect, but I chalked it up to being unused to this level of isolation. That night, I sat by the creek working on a watercolor of the bridge. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest around me grew darker and the silence became oppressive. There were no birds, no insects, just the sound of the water trickling over rocks. I tried to focus on my painting, but a strange unease crept over me. It was like the air had shifted, growing heavier, colder, and then I heard it, a faint humming. It was soft at first, almost melodic, but it didn't seem to have a source. It wasn't coming from the creek or the woods. It was just there. I froze, my brush hovering over the paper. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was a woman's voice humming a tune I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. The humming stopped abruptly, as if I'd startled it. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. I told myself it must have been the wind or some trick of acoustics. I packed up my supplies and hurried back to the RV. The next morning, I woke to find my art supplies scattered across the ground outside the RV. My brushes were snapped in half, my paint spilled and smeared across the dirt. My first thought was that an animal had gotten into them, but there were no paw prints, no signs of disturbance other than the destruction itself. It didn't make sense. I spent the day trying to paint, but something felt off. The colors didn't look right. The lines felt shaky. Frustrated, I decided to take a break and explore more of the area. The old bridge drew me in again, its weathered planks creaking under my boots as I crossed it. The creek below was impossibly still, and its surface like a mirror reflecting the gnarled tree overhead. On the far side of the bridge, I noticed something etched into one of the trees. A name and a date carved deep into the bark: Margaret 1893. The letters were uneven, as if done in haste, but what caught my attention was the feeling that swept over me as I touched the carving. A sudden, overwhelming sadness that didn't feel like my own. That night, the humming returned. I was inside the RV, trying to sketch, when I heard it again, drifting through the stillness. It was louder this time, unmistakable. The sound seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The air was icy, much colder than it had been earlier, and the forest was eerily quiet. The humming led me to the bridge, where the fog had thickened, shrouding the creek in an otherworldly glow. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the creek, her back to me. She wore a long dress, the kind you'd see in old photographs, and her hair cascaded down her back in dark waves. She was humming that same mournful tune, the sound weaving through the air like a spell. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. She stopped humming, but didn't turn around. I took a hesitant step closer, and as I did, she began to dissolve, her form breaking apart like mist until there was nothing left but the fog. I stood there frozen, unsure if what I'd seen was real or some trick of the light in my overactive imagination. The next day, I decided to drive into town to clear my head. At a small gas station, I struck up a conversation with the attendant, an older man who seemed to know the area well. "You're camping by the bridge, aren't you?" he asked when I mentioned Paint Creek. "Yeah. Why?" He hesitated, then said, "People say it's haunted. They call her the Lady of Paint Creek. Story goes, she was abandoned by her husband during a harsh winter. He promised to come back for her, but he never did. She waited by that bridge until she froze to death. Now she haunts the creek, looking for people to join her." I laughed nervously, but his expression remained serious. "I'd avoid that bridge if I were you," he added, "especially at night." That evening, I couldn't stay away. Something about the Lady of Paint Creek drew me in like a moth to a flame. I set up my easel near the bridge, determined to capture her essence in my painting. As the hours passed and the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog rolled in again, and the humming returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. The air around me grew colder, and when I looked up, there she was, standing in the middle of the bridge. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her hollow eyes bore into mine. She didn't move, but the humming turned into words, a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Stay with me." I backed away, but my foot slipped on the wet grass, and I looked up. When I looked up, but the feeling of her presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. I grabbed my supplies and ran back to the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, I dreamed of her. In the dream, I was standing on the bridge, staring down at the icy water. She appeared beside me, her hand cold as she touched my arm. "He left me," she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "They all leave." When I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, just beyond the edges of my vision. I knew I had to do something to end this, to break her hold on me. On my final night at Paint Creek, I returned to the bridge with my sketchbook and paints. The fog was thicker than ever, and the cold seeped into my bones. I set up my supplies and began to paint, my hands trembling as I worked. I painted her story, the bridge, the creek, her lonely figure waiting in the snow. As I finished, the humming surrounded me, and she appeared again, this time closer. Her hollow eyes were filled with tears, and she reached out a hand toward the painting. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. "You're remembered now," I said, my voice breaking. "You're not forgotten." She stared at the painting for what felt like an eternity, then dissolved into the mist, her presence lifting like a weight from my chest. The forest grew quiet again, and for the first time I felt a sense of peace. I left Paint Creek the next morning, the painting tucked safely in the RV. It's one of my best works, but I've never been able to sell it. Something about it feels sacred, like it belongs to her. Even now, I hear her humming in my dreams, but it's softer now, almost peaceful, as if she's finally found rest. And maybe in a way, so have I.
My name is Jack Henry to my friends, and I'm 34 years old. This happened last summer when the desert was blazing hot, and I was just trying to clear my head. I'd gone through a rough divorce a few months earlier, and I thought some time alone in Anza Borrego Desert State Park would help me get my life back on track. The open sky, the silence, the sense of control over my little RV. I needed that, or so I thought. I pulled into the park on a Friday afternoon. The drive-in had been uneventful, the roads empty, the land stretching out endlessly under a white-hot sun. It was exactly what I wanted, isolation. My RV, newly refurbished after I had spent weeks tinkering with it in my garage, hummed like a dream as I steered it toward a remote camping spot off the main trails. The ranger I checked in with had warned me about the heat and the lack of visitors this time of year, but I waved him off. "I've got plenty of supplies," I said, patting the case of bottled water in the passenger seat. I set up camp near a cluster of jagged rocks with a view of the Borrego Badlands. The air shimmered with heat, but the solitude was intoxicating. I spent the first few hours hiking out to photograph the strange alien landscape. Desert floor cracked like a broken mirror, cacti standing like sentinels against the horizon. As the sun dipped lower, casting the Badlands in shades of gold and crimson, I felt the first stirrings of peace. The first night, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, a soft, steady rustling, but as I lay there staring at the ceiling of my RV, I realized it wasn't random. It was rhythmic, like footsteps. My pulse quickened. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. The desert was deathly silent, the stars blazing overhead like frozen fireworks. There was no wind, no movement, just me in the sand. I walked a few paces around the RV, scanning the ground, but there was nothing there. Still, the feeling lingered that I wasn't alone. The next day, I set out early to explore one of the park's famous slot canyons. The heat was already oppressive by mid-morning, my water bottle sweating in my pack as I hiked. I noticed something odd. A lone dead tree stood at the edge of the trail, its branches twisted into unnatural angles. I was sure I hadn't seen it yesterday. Shrugging it off, I continued into the canyon, snapping pictures of the narrow, winding walls. But as I climbed out the other side, I saw the tree again, identical, down to the broken limb dangling like a skeletal arm. My stomach tightened. It wasn't possible. By the time I got back to the RV, I was drenched in sweat and shaken. The tree wasn't the only thing along the trail. I'd seen a crumbled rock formation that seemed to follow me, appearing in different places each time I turned a corner. I chalked it up to heat exhaustion and downed a full bottle of water, but the unease lingered. That evening, the footsteps returned, louder this time, circling the RV. I stayed inside, peering through the curtains, my heart pounding. Then I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling for help. "Hello?" I yelled, stepping to the door. "Is someone out there?" The voice didn't answer, but the footsteps stopped. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing but sand and rock. I told myself it was an echo, maybe my own voice bouncing off the canyon walls, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I decided to leave. Something about this place wasn't right. As I packed up, my RV refused to start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch. Despite the hours I'd spent fine-tuning it, I cursed under my breath, sweat dripping down my face as I tinkered under the hood. By noon, I gave up. The heat was unbearable, my water supply dwindling faster than I'd planned. I checked my phone. No signal. The ranger station was miles away, and the thought of hiking back in this heat made my stomach churn. I decided to stay one more night, hoping the engine trouble was a fluke. That's when I noticed the symbols. They were etched into the ground near my campsite, circles, spirals, and crude arrows scratched into the dirt. I hadn't seen them the night before. Kneeling down, I traced one with my finger. It felt fresh, like someone had drawn it within the last few hours. A chill crept over me despite the heat. That night, I saw him. I was sitting by the fire, trying to focus on my journal instead of the oppressive silence. The desert seemed to hold its breath, the usual hum of insects and distant coyote calls replaced by a suffocating stillness. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stood on the ridge above my camp, silhouetted against the starlit sky. At first, I thought it was another camper, but something about the way it moved was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its posture hunched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hey!" I called, grabbing my flashlight. "Who's there?" The beam caught nothing but empty air. The figure had vanished. The footsteps returned later, louder than ever, circling my RV with an almost mocking rhythm. I sat inside, gripping my pocket knife as objects began to move on their own. My journal flew off the counter, landing open on the floor. The radio crackled to life, spewing static that almost sounded like whispers. Then came the knock, a single deliberate rap on the door. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. Silence. I stayed awake all night, my nerves stretched to the breaking point. The next day, I ventured out, desperate to find answers. I retraced my steps to the slot canyon, my eyes scanning the ground for more symbols. That's when I found it, a grave marker hidden among the rocks. It was little more than a weathered stone with a name etched into it. Elias Thatcher, 1886. The symbols I'd seen earlier surrounded it. I stared at the grave, my mind racing. Elias Thatcher, he must have been a pioneer, one of the many who passed through these deserts in the 19th century. Had he gotten lost, like I was? Had he died alone out here, wandering endlessly in search of water? I felt the air shift, the temperature dropping despite the blazing sun. Turning, I saw the figure again, closer this time. Its face was shadowed, but its presence was unmistakable. It didn't move, just stood there watching me. Elias, I whispered, the name trembling on my lips. Is that you? That night, I made an offering. I placed a bottle of water in my journal, filled with sketches and notes about the desert, on the grave. You're not lost anymore, I said aloud, my voice shaking. You're found. The desert fell silent, the oppressive heat lifting like a weight from my chest. I didn't see the figure again, but I felt something, like a presence retreating. Finally, at peace, the next morning my RV started without a hitch. As I drove away, the landscape seemed brighter, the air clearer. My GPS and compass, which had been useless the past few days, suddenly worked again. I left Anza Borrego with more questions than answers, but one thing was certain. The desert holds its secrets tightly, and not all of them are meant to be uncovered. Even now, I think about Elias Thatcher, about the footsteps and the symbols, about how close I came to losing myself out there. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the desert's gaze watching, waiting. My name is Howard Cartwright, and this happened to me back in October 1994 while hiking in the Dunes National Forest in Oregon. At the time, I was in my mid-30s, trying to shake off the grind of my monotonous office job in Portland. I'd always found solace in the wilderness, and this trip was meant to be just another weekend escape from the hum of city life. Little did I know it would nearly cost me my life. That morning, the forest was wrapped in a veil of early fog, the kind that clings to your skin and muffles the world around you. I parked at a trailhead near Sparks Lake, packed light, and intended to camp by a spot overlooking the lava fields. The air was crisp with the tang of pine and earth, and the silence was punctuated only by the occasional call of a crow. I had been walking for hours when I spotted the first odd thing, a tattered orange backpack snagged in the branches of a tall fir. It looked like it had been there for a while, frayed and weathered by the elements. I stopped and stared at it, debating whether to climb up and check it out. My instincts told me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. The climb was tricky, the bark rough against my palms, but I managed to snag the bag. Inside were some torn maps, a broken compass, and an old Polaroid camera. The film cartridge was missing, but what struck me was the dried blood on the strap. My stomach twisted, but I convinced myself it was just an old hunting accident. I stuffed it in my pack and pressed on, ignoring the chill creeping up my spine. By late afternoon, the fog lifted, giving way to golden sunlight that dappled through the canopy. I set up camp on a small ridge overlooking the lava fields. The landscape below looked alien, jagged black rocks stretching for miles. As I prepared my dinner, I kept glancing back at the backpack. Something about it felt wrong, but I told myself I was overthinking it. Nightfall came quickly, and with it an unnatural quiet. Even the crickets seemed to hush. I stoked my fire, trying to dispel the unease settling in my chest. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A sharp, wet crunch like bones snapping under weight. I froze, my hand gripping the hilt of a small hunting knife I carried. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the faintest rustle of underbrush. I shone my flashlight toward the noise, but the beam only illuminated the dense thicket. "Who's there?" I called, trying to steady my voice. No answer. Just the oppressive silence, thick and suffocating. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, but nothing else happened. By dawn, my nerves were frayed, but I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a cougar or a bear. I packed up and decided to cut my trip short. The forest, however, seemed to have other plans. As I made my way back to the trailhead, I began noticing subtle changes. Trees that looked familiar seemed out of place. Fallen logs I hadn't seen before blocked my path. It was as if the forest itself was shifting, leading me deeper into its grasp. Around midday, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A clearing littered with animal carcasses. Deer, raccoons, and what looked like a coyote. Their bodies were arranged in a crude circle, bones stripped bare and glinting in the sun. At the center was something that looked like an altar, a slab of rock smeared with what I could only assume was blood. My breath hitched as I scanned the area, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wasn't alone. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure. At first, I thought it was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and draped in what looked like tattered clothing. But as it turned its head toward me, I realized it was something else entirely. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a grotesque amalgamation of exposed muscle and sinew. Its mouth split wide into something resembling a grin. I didn't think. I ran. The forest seemed to close in around me as I bolted, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The thing chased me, its footsteps heavy and uneven, like it was dragging something behind it. I could hear its raspy breaths, each exhale sounding like a predator savoring the hunt. I reached a rocky outcrop and scrambled up, barely keeping my footing. The creature let out a noise that turned my stomach, a high-pitched keening that echoed through the trees. It didn't try to climb after me, but circled the base, its movements deliberate, calculating. I threw a rock at it, hitting its shoulder, but it didn't flinch. Desperation clawed at my mind as I scanned my surroundings. That's when I spotted the narrow crevice in the rocks, a potential hiding spot. I squeezed into the gap, the stones scraping against my back, and held my breath. The creature's footsteps grew louder, then stopped just outside my hiding spot. I could hear it sniffing, the sound nauseatingly wet. It crouched down, peering into the crevice, its grotesque face inches from mine. In the dim light, I could see its torso covered in scars, some fresh and oozing. It tilted its head, as if trying to decide whether to reach in or move on. And then it lunged, an arm shooting into the crevice. Its claws raked my leg, drawing blood, but I kicked back with all my strength, slamming my boot into its distorted hand. It snarled and recoiled, giving me just enough time to crawl deeper into the crevice. The creature pounded against the rocks, its frustration evident. I felt the vibrations reverberate through the stone, but the crevice held firm. After what felt like an eternity, the pounding stopped. I waited, heart hammering in my chest, until I was certain it was gone. Hours passed before I dared to crawl out. My leg throbbed where it had clawed me, the wound ugly but not deep. I limped my way back to the trailhead, clutching my knife like a lifeline. When I finally reached my car, I didn't look back. Later, I handed the bloody backpack to the authorities, who seemed skeptical of my story but took it for evidence. A search team was sent into the forest, but found nothing. No altar, no carcasses, no sign of the creature. I never went hiking alone again. I thought it was just another day in the field, another operation deep in the wild, but now I'm here trying to wrap my head around how it all went to hell. My name is Mason Gaves, and this happened in October 1986, somewhere in the dense, shadowed expanse of the Ozark National Forest. I was working a covert reconnaissance mission as a Green Beret tasked with investigating reports of unusual disturbances in the area. Locals had been whispering about people disappearing, livestock being torn apart in ways no known predator could manage, and strange sounds that carried through the trees at night. The brass didn't take it seriously, but the assignment came down anyway. A box we could tick off while we prepped for something bigger. The forest was massive, a thick tangle of hickories and pines that swallowed the sun by mid-afternoon. It was the kind of place that had secrets, hidden caves, forgotten trails, and a quiet that pressed down on you like a weight. I was with two other guys from my unit, Colin Dry, a sarcastic marksman with a knack for calling out danger before it happened, and Alex Fry, a medic, quieter but with nerves of steel. We were all armed to the teeth, Standard issue M16s, sidearms, and enough equipment to survive weeks out there. It was supposed to be a 2-day recon, nothing more. It didn't take long for things to start feeling wrong. The forest had this eerie stillness, like even the birds and insects knew to stay quiet. We came across a mutilated deer on the first day, its body split open with surgical precision, but there were no signs of predators. Fry crouched beside it, shaking his head. No claw marks, no tracks. Whatever did this, it's not normal, he said, his voice slow. Dry scanned the tree line, his rifle ready. If it's not normal, then it's our job to find it and put it down. Keep moving. That night, we set up camp in a small clearing, just big enough to see the stars through the canopy. We agreed on a rotating watch schedule, but even during my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I chalked it up to paranoia. After all, we were trained for this. Fear was an enemy you had to keep in check. Then came the noise. It started as a faint rustling in the distance, too deliberate to be the wind. Dry, who was supposed to be sleeping, sat up and grabbed his rifle. Fry was already awake, his eyes darting toward the sound. It was circling us, moving just beyond the edge of our sight. I flicked on my flashlight and scanned the darkness, but the beam only seemed to make the shadows deeper. "Eyes up!" Dry hissed, his tone sharp. Something stepped into the clearing, something that didn't belong. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with a hunched frame covered in what looked like patches of matted fur. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, like it wasn't bound by the same laws of nature as the rest of us. Its face, God, its face was a nightmare, stretched and twisted, like it had been molded by a child who didn't understand what a person should look like. And it was fast. The thing launched at Dry first, its arm whipping out with inhuman speed. He got a shot off, a clean hit in the chest, but it didn't stop. It slammed into him, throwing him into a tree with a sickening crack. Fry yelled something I couldn't make out as he opened fire, the burst sliding up the clearing. I joined in, aiming for its center mass, but it was like shooting at a ghost. It moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, weaving between the trees, its body contorting unnaturally as it dodged our bullets. Dry wasn't moving. I could see the blood pooling beneath him, dark against the forest floor. "Fall back!" I shouted, grabbing Fry by the vest. We sprinted deeper into the woods, the sound of its pursuit never far behind. It wasn't just running, it was toying with us, letting us think we had a chance before closing the distance again. We reached an old hunting cabin, half-rotted and barely standing, but it was better than nothing. Fry barricaded the door while I checked the ammo count and my rifle. We were running low, too low to take it down. "What the hell is that thing?" Fry panted, his hands shaking as he clutched his sidearm. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it bleeds. That means we can kill it." The cabin was small, with one broken window and a trapdoor leading to a root cellar. We didn't have many options. The creature circled the cabin, its claws scraping against the wood. It was trying to scare us, to make us panic. Then it hit the door. The force was enough to splinter the wood, sending shards flying. I fired through the opening, hearing the satisfying thud of impact. It howled, not like any animal I'd ever heard, but like something ancient, something wrong. Fry fired next, aiming for its head. The thing didn't go down, but it stumbled. That was enough. "Cellar," I yelled. We scrambled down the trapdoor, slamming it shut behind us. It wasn't much of a hiding spot, but it bought us time. The creature's footsteps thudded above us, slow and deliberate. It was searching, taking its time now. Fry was pale, his breath shallow. "Dry's dead," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "I know," I said, gripping my rifle tighter, "but we're not." The creature didn't wait long. It ripped the trapdoor clean off, its grotesque face peering down at us. I didn't think, I just fired, emptying my mag into its chest and neck. It dropped into the cellar, thrashing wildly, its claws tearing through the air. Fry screamed as it caught him, dragging him toward the corner. I grabbed my combat knife and lunged, plunging it into the creature's back with everything I had. The thing roared, its focus shifting to me. Fry was free, crawling toward the stairs as I wrestled with the creature. It was stronger than anything I'd ever fought, its limbs thrashing like steel cables. I stabbed it again and again, the blade sinking into flesh that felt too cold, too wrong. It slammed me against the wall, my vision blurring from the impact. I thought that was it, that I was done. But Fry came back, wielding a rusted axe he'd found in the corner. He brought it down on the creature's neck, severing its head with a sickening crunch. The body collapsed, twitching, but it didn't get back up. We stumbled out of the cellar, bloody and barely standing. Fry was limping, his face as pale as a ghost. I didn't have the energy to check how bad my injuries were. The sun was rising by the time we made it back to the main road, where a ranger truck was parked. The look on the ranger's face when he saw us covered in blood, carrying our weapons, told me he didn't believe a word of what we told him, but he didn't argue when we led him back to the cabin. The creature's body was still there, just as we'd left it. Later, when the Hups took over, they called it a wild animal attack. They didn't ask too many questions, and neither did we. But I know what I saw. My name is Anna Sophia, and I'm 30 years old. This happened in early October, just as the leaves began to change, but before the heavy snowfalls could bury the trails. My friends and I had planned a 3-day camping trip on Mount Shasta, a place I've hiked countless times. I thought I knew the mountain. I thought I was prepared for anything. I was wrong. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting golden light across the jagged peaks. Liam, my fiancé, parked our SUV near the trailhead where Jordan and Kelsey were waiting. Jordan, my best friend since high school, was practically bouncing with excitement, his hiking boots crunching against the gravel. He was 30, lanky, and had that mischievous grin that usually meant trouble. Kelsey, a friend of Jordan's I barely knew, was a stark contrast. Around my age, she had bright eyes and an air of calm about her that I found reassuring. She offered a quick smile as I introduced Liam, who nodded politely. Liam, at 31, was the kind of person you wanted with you on a trip like this. Steady and cautious, though maybe a little too much for Jordan's taste. "This place is incredible," Jordan said, spinning in a slow circle. "You know, people say Mount Shasta is a vortex for supernatural energy. We might see something cool, or we might just enjoy the scenery." Liam said, pulling his pack from the car. "We'll see." Jordan smirked. "Don't worry, Mr. Logic. I brought a spirit board just in case." I groaned. "Jordan, no! We talked about this. Leave that nonsense in the car." "Relax, Anna," he said. "It's just for fun." The first day was perfect. The trail was steep but manageable, and the views were spectacular. We set up camp near Castle Lake, a serene body of water surrounded by dense forest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we sat around the fire, sharing stories and toasting marshmallows. Even Liam seemed to relax. That night, I woke to the sound of faint singing. It was high-pitched and melodic, drifting through the trees like the wind carrying a distant lullaby. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, listening. The others were asleep, their breaths steady and deep. The singing faded, and I told myself it was just the wind. I closed my eyes and willed myself back to sleep. The next morning, I found Jordan inspecting his tent. One of the poles had snapped clean in half. "It's weird," he said. "I swear it was fine last night." "We'll fix it later," I said, glancing uneasily at the tree line. "We need to move if we want to reach the next site before dark." As we passed, I noticed my compass spinning wildly, the needle refusing to settle. I tapped it, shook it, but nothing helped. Then Liam's GPS started acting up, displaying error messages despite the clear sky. Kelsey frowned as she watched us. "Something feels off," she said softly. Jordan laughed. "Probably Anna's bad vibes because I brought the spirit board." Liam shot him a glare. "You're not seriously still planning to use that thing, are you?" Jordan shrugged. "Maybe." The second campsite was deeper into the forest, more secluded. By the time we reached it, the trees loomed so high above us they seemed to block out the sun. We set up camp quickly, though the uneasy feeling from the morning lingered. That evening, Jordan insisted on pulling out the spirit board. "Let's just see if anyone wants to talk," he said, wiggling his eyebrows. "No way," I snapped. I'm serious. This isn't funny. But Jordan was already setting it up, and Kelsey, to my surprise, didn't protest. She watched with quiet curiosity as he placed his fingers on the planchette. Is anyone here? He asked in a sing-song voice. Any spirits want to chat? The fire crackled and a cold breeze swept through the campsite. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette jerked under Jordan's fingers. Whoa, he whispered, his grin fading. Jordan stopped messing around, Liam said. I'm not, Jordan said, his voice low. It's moving on its own. The planchette spelled out one word, leave. We all froze. Even Jordan looked shaken. That's enough, I said, grabbing the board and throwing it into the fire. The flames roared higher for a brief moment, and then everything went still. Too still. The usual hum of the forest, crickets rustling, leaves rustling, distant animal calls had vanished. That night, the singing returned. It was louder this time, and it wasn't alone. Whispers joined the melody, soft and insidious, circling our campsite like invisible predators, and then came the footsteps. Liam sat bolt upright, clutching my arm. Do you hear that? I nodded, my heart pounding. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving just beyond the firelight. Jordan grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the trees. Hello? He called. Who's out there? The beam landed on something. Someone. A figure stood just beyond the light, motionless. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long. His face was obscured by shadow. Hey, Jordan yelled, stepping closer. Jordan, don't, I hissed. The figure tilted its head and a low, guttural growl rumbled from its chest. Then it stepped forward just enough for the light to reveal its face. Its eyes were empty pockets, and its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, filled with sharp, glistening teeth. We didn't sleep. We huddled by the fire, clutching knives and makeshift weapons as the creature prowled the edge of the campsite. It didn't attack but made its presence known, scratching at trees, growling, mimicking our voices. At one point, it called Liam's name in my voice, and he nearly walked into the woods before Kelsey grabbed him. We need to leave, she whispered. At night? Liam asked, his voice shaking. It'll pick us off one by one, I said, my voice firm despite the terror gripping me. We have to try. At first light, we packed our gear and started back toward the trailhead. The forest seemed to shift around us, the trees closing in, the trail vanishing and reappearing in places it shouldn't. Then Jordan screamed. We turned to see him sprawled on the ground, claw marks raking across his chest. Blood soaked his shirt and his face was pale as he gasped for air. It's here, he choked out. Kelsey grabbed a handful of salt from our cooking supplies and scattered it around Jordan. The creature appeared again just beyond the circle, its empty eyes fixed on us. It growled but didn't cross the salt. It can't pass, Kelsey said, her voice trembling. Salt's a barrier. We built another fire and surrounded it with salt, waiting for the creature to weaken as the sun rose higher. When it finally retreated into the shadows, we carried Jordan and ran. We made it back to the trailhead by noon, battered and terrified but alive. Jordan was rushed to the hospital, his wounds deep but not life-threatening. When we told a local ranger what had happened, he went pale. People talk about skinwalkers up there, he said. They're not just stories. You're lucky to be alive. I didn't feel lucky. None of us did. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting for the next. My name is Ben Harper, and I'm 35 years old. This happened in the spring of last year, during what was supposed to be a laid-back hiking trip in Yosemite National Park. It's taken me months to piece together what I saw, to even believe it myself. Honestly, I'm not sure I ever will. It started with a simple idea. Film an off-the-beaten-path trek for my YouTube channel. I've been documenting hiking trips for years, focusing on little-known trails, urban legends, and survival tips. This time I chose Hetchy Valley, a quieter part of Yosemite that's as beautiful as it is remote. Joining me were my girlfriend Nina, 29, her bright caution always balancing my adventurous streak, my lifelong buddy Travis, 31, who's fearless to a fault, and Kelly, a shy 26-year-old who was tagging along for her first real hike. This will be epic, I told them as we piled into the car. Untouched trails, hidden waterfalls, plus the myths about spirits guarding the valley. People eat that stuff up. Nina gave me a look. Let's not eat it up too much ourselves, okay? Travis smirked. Ben, I bet you're just hoping for a ghost cameo in your video. Top 10 haunted, right? Kelly stayed quiet, fidgeting with her pack straps. We reached the trailhead around midday. The sun glinted off Hetchy's reservoir. The granite cliffs stood tall around us, and a faint breeze carried the scent of pine. You guys ready? I asked, camera in hand. Kelly nodded hesitantly. Yeah, totally ready. The first day went smoothly, aside from Kelly struggling with her boots. By evening, we'd set up camp in a small clearing near the tree line. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a deep hush settled over the forest. It was the kind of silence that isn't peaceful, it's expectant. We sat around the fire, the warmth fighting off the night's chill. I was reviewing some footage when Nina stiffened beside me. Do you hear that? She asked. I strained my ears. At first there was nothing, but then faint and melodic came the sound of whistling. It's just the wind, Travis said, tossing another log onto the fire. It's not the wind, Nina shot back. Kelly looked up, her eyes wide. It's weird, like it's trying to sound human. I chuckled nervously. Guys, relax, it's probably just some bird. But deep down, something about it unsettled me. The next day, we hiked deeper into the valley. The trail became rougher, the markers sparse. Around noon, we started noticing odd scratches on the trees, long, deliberate marks that didn't look natural. Mountain lion, maybe? I suggested. Nina frowned. A mountain lion carving symbols into the bark? She wasn't wrong. Some of the marks almost resembled letters, though not in any language I recognized. Kelly hung back, her steps faltering. I don't like this. Can we just turn around? We're fine, Travis said seriously. It's just some bored campers messing around. Yeah, I agreed, though the unease in my gut was growing. We'll camp tonight and head back tomorrow. That evening, the whistling returned. It seemed closer now, circling our camp. Nina grabbed my arm. Ben, that's not a bird. Travis, trying to lighten the mood, stood and whistled back. The sound stopped abruptly. Travis, Nina snapped. He grinned. What? It's probably just some other hikers. But as the silence stretched on, even his bravado faded. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. Light, deliberate steps, like someone trying to avoid being heard. Nina? I whispered. She stirred beside me. What? You hear that? Her eyes widened, and she nodded. We lay frozen, listening as the steps moved around the camp. Then from Kelly's tent came a faint, trembling voice. Mom? Nina bolted upright. What the hell? I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold. Kelly was standing by the edge of the clearing, her back to us. Kelly? I called. She didn't respond. Travis stumbled out of his tent, groggy. What's going on? Nina grabbed his arm. Something's wrong with Kelly. I moved closer to her. Kelly, hey, what's going on? She turned slowly, her face pale. I heard her. My mom, she's out there. She's calling me. Nina stepped forward. Kelly, your mom isn't here. You're just, no. Kelly interrupted, her voice shaking. I heard her. She's out there. Behind her, the woods seemed to breathe, the shadows shifting unnaturally. Get back to the tent, I said firmly, my heart pounding. Kelly hesitated, then nodded, her gaze lingering on the dark trees. The next morning, we woke to find Kelly gone. Her footprints led toward the reservoir, but the trail became erratic, crisscrossing itself. We followed her cries for help, but they came from all directions, overlapping and distorted. Then we found her, or something that looked like her. She stood in a clearing, her back to us again. Kelly? Nina called. She turned, but her movements were wrong, jerky as though she were a puppet on strings. Her face was blank, her eyes glowing faintly in the morning light. That's not Kelly, Nina whispered, her voice trembling. The figure smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin, and took a step toward us. Its form began to shift, growing taller, its limbs elongating. The skinwalker. There was no denying it now. It let out a low, guttural laugh. Run, I shouted. We bolted. The creature's footsteps pounded behind us. Travis, always the bravest or the dumbest, stopped and grabbed a branch. Keep going, he yelled. Travis, no, Nina screamed, but he charged the creature. I looked back just in time to see it swipe at him, sending him flying into a tree with a sickening crack. We didn't stop running until we reached a marked trail. Only then did we collapse, gasping for breath. "We can't leave him," Nina sobbed. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "He's gone." Kelly appeared from the trees then, or what was left of her. Her voice was a warped echo of itself, and her eyes gleamed with malevolence. The skinwalker had taken her. We made it back to the trailhead by nightfall, though it felt like days had passed. I don't remember much of the drive home, just Nina's hand gripping mine tightly, her knuckles white. Travis's body was never found. Neither was Kelly's. I've stopped filming my hikes, but sometimes I catch myself reviewing that last footage, searching for answers. And in the final clip, just before the camera cuts out, I see Travis standing among the trees, his eyes glowing faintly, a grotesque smile twisting his face. My name is Oliver Albert, and I'm 32 years old. This happened just a few months ago when I decided to drive my RV up the Lost Coast in Northern California. I wanted to escape my life, what little was left of it. My marriage was over, my photography career was circling the drain, and I'd stopped talking to my family years ago. This trip was supposed to be my reset, my way of finding something real to hold on to. I got more than I bargained for. It was early November, and the coastal air was damp and heavy as I made my way north on winding roads. My RV wasn't fancy, but it was reliable enough. I had my camera gear, a few days' worth of supplies, and an old tattered map I picked up at a gas station. That's where I first saw it. The map had a stretch of road marked with thick red ink. Highway 211, closed to all traffic. It wasn't on Google Maps, and I couldn't find any mention of it online. I thought it would make for an interesting story, an abandoned highway swallowed by time and nature. Maybe I could even snap some award-winning photos of the eerie, forgotten stretch. I should have left it alone. I was driving through Shelter Cove when I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder of the road, thumb out, her dark hair falling in waves over her face. I almost didn't stop, but something about her felt familiar, like I'd seen her before, though I couldn't place where. She smiled as she climbed in, tossing a small beat-up backpack onto the seat. "Thanks for stopping," she said. "Not a lot of people do these days." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. "Where are you headed?" I asked. She hesitated. "Just up the coast." We didn't talk much after that. She seemed nice enough, but there was something off about her. Her clothes looked out of place, like they were from another decade, and her hands, they were pale and cold, like she'd been standing in the fog for hours. We passed the last town, and I saw the faded sign for Highway 2011. It was barely legible, almost swallowed by overgrown bushes. Road closed. No entry. "That's it," Janine said softly, staring out the window. I glanced at her. "You've been here before?" "Once," she murmured. "A long time ago." Something in her tone made the hair on my neck stand up, but I shook it off and turned onto the narrow, crumbling road. The RV's tires crunched on gravel as the trees closed in around us, their branches forming a canopy that blotted out the sun. The fog rolled in suddenly, thick and heavy like a living thing. It clung to the RV, muffling the sound of the engine. My headlights barely cut through it, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Then the radio started acting up. I wasn't even playing music, but static crackled through the speakers, and underneath it, I could have sworn I heard voices, faint, almost like whispers. "You hear that?" I asked Janine. She didn't answer. Her face was pressed against the window, staring into the fog. That's when I saw the car. It was an old, rusted sedan, half buried in mud and leaning at an unnatural angle. The windows were shattered, and the driver's door hung open. "Looks like it's been here a while," I said, but Janine didn't respond. I glanced at her. She looked pale, her hands gripping the edges of her seat. "Everything okay?" I asked. She turned to me slowly, her eyes wide. "We shouldn't have come here." About a mile later, we saw the lodge. It was an old roadside building, its paint peeling and its sign barely legible, Hilltop, vacancy. "I don't remember this being here," Janine said under her breath. It's probably abandoned, I replied, but something about it pulled at me. We parked outside, and I grabbed my camera, eager to get some shots of the decaying structure. The air smelled damp and musty, and the windows were cracked or boarded up. As I snapped photos, I noticed something strange. The wallpaper inside the building, visible through the broken windows, seemed to form patterns, faces contorted and screaming. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing footsteps circling the RV. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then came the tapping, slow, deliberate knocks on the windows. I sat up, clutching my flashlight. "Janine?" I whispered. "Did you hear that?" She didn't move. She was sitting up straight, staring at the door. "They're coming," she said flatly. My blood ran cold. "Who's coming?" Before she could answer, the tapping turned into pounding. The RV shook as if something massive was slamming against it. I grabbed the keys and started the engine, desperate to get away, but the headlights only illuminated dense fog. Then I saw them, figures in the mist, their outlines shifting and flickering. They had no faces, just empty voids where eyes and mouths should have been. "They won't let us leave," Janine said, her voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" I shouted, panic clawing at my chest. She turned to me, and for the first time I saw real fear in her eyes. "I didn't survive the crash," she whispered. "I thought I did, but I've been here ever since, waiting." The words didn't make sense. "You're not making any sense." "I've been trying to leave, but they won't let me. They need someone new to take my place." We drove back to the lodge, the pounding growing louder as the figures closed in. The lodge seemed to glow faintly in the fog, its windows alive with flickering light. "They want you to stay," Janine said, "but you can fight them. You have to." I didn't know what to believe anymore. I grabbed my camera and started taking photos, hoping the flash would drive them back. Each time the light went off, the figures recoiled, their shapes distorting. Janine stayed behind, her form flickering like static on an old TV. "Go," she shouted, "before it's too late." I didn't want to leave her, but I could feel the darkness closing in. The RV roared to life, and I sped down the crumbling road. The lodge and its horrors disappeared into the fog behind me. I made it to a ranger station at dawn. When I told Ranger Matthews what happened, he just shook his head. "That stretch of road? It's cursed. People go there, but they don't always come back. Or if they do, they're different." I didn't tell him about Janine. I wasn't sure she'd ever really been there. Back in the city, I developed the photos. They were clear as day. Janine, standing beside the lodge, her face pale and hollow. And in the last photo, taken from inside the RV, I saw something that still haunts me. A figure standing behind me, its faceless head tilted as if it were smiling.